Welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be taking a look today at all the big stories from March 15th, 2025. You know, think of this as your daily briefing, the need to know info pulled from a whole bunch of different sources just for you.
Exactly. We've gone through tons of national and international news reports just to give you a good overview of everything that's going on.
Yeah, and there's a lot going on.
Oh, for sure. I mean, here in the U.S., we've got major policy changes happening, a really important court decision, a big speech, not to mention all the usual daily happenings.
Right, and globally too, a lot of major situations are continuing to develop.
Absolutely.
Okay, so our goal here is to make sense of it all. By the end of this, we want you to walk away knowing what matters and why, without getting totally overwhelmed by all the information.
Right. No information overload here. So
Yeah.
where do you want to jump in?
Well, how about we start with some of the big things happening here in the U.S.?
Perfect.
All right, let's talk about the Trump administration's latest move on immigration.
Okay. Sounds good.
So, the Department of Homeland Security just launched a massive new international ad campaign, multi-million-dollar effort, really spearheaded by President Trump.
Yeah, and the thing that stands out is the scope of it.
Yeah.
It's huge. And the message, oh, it's very direct. Secretary Noem was very clear about it. The goal is to deter illegal immigration. They're saying straight up, U.S. borders are closed.
You're messing around.
Nope. And anyone who enters the country illegally, they will find you and they will deport you.
So, a very firm stance, and they're really getting that message out there. I mean, they're using radio, TV, online, you name it. And they're targeting multiple countries.
Oh, yeah, multiple. Not only that, they're tailoring the messages with different dialects.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they're even reaching specific groups through social media and text messaging. It's a really comprehensive approach.
Super targeted.
Very much so. And when you take a step back and look at the big picture, this campaign really shows how much they're investing, both financially and politically, to enforce these immigration policies.
A big commitment for sure.
It is. They're trying to, discourage potential migrants before they even start their journey.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so shifting gears a bit to some more positive domestic news. There's been a pretty significant development for the wildland firefighters.
Right, some good news for once. The Department of the Interior just announced a permanent pay raise for all the federal and tribal wildland firefighters. This isn't temporary, it's a long-term thing.
Which is fantastic, especially given the increasing demands on these firefighters with these bigger, more devastating wildfires.
Absolutely, it's well-deserved.
Definitely. This pay raise is going to help recruit and keep the highly skilled people that we need in these critical roles.
Right, and it's important to understand, this is a direct result of that full-year Continuing Appropriations and Extensions Act.
Yeah, the bill that funds all the government operations.
Exactly. And it passed with bipartisan support in Congress just recently and was signed into law.
Oh, wow.
So that shows you there's widespread agreement, on both sides of the aisle that we need to take care of these firefighters.
Right. Everyone agrees on this one.
They do.
So this isn't just talk. It actually sets up new permanent salary scales for all levels of firefighters, even the temporary and seasonal folks. Plus, there's dedicated funding now for tribal nations to give their firefighters extra pay on top of that.
Yeah, and it replaces those temporary supplements they've had to rely on, and it also introduces something called incident response premium pay.
Oh, okay, so that's for the longer, more demanding deployments, right?
Exactly. And again, the fact that it had bipartisan support, it really just shows you how much everyone recognizes the danger of these wildfires and how important these firefighters are in protecting our communities and natural resources.
Absolutely. Okay, so now for something completely different, a major legal development regarding DEI programs.
Diversity, equity, inclusion.
Right,
Yeah.
DEI. So an appeals court just lifted those blocks that were in place on President Trump's executive orders, the ones aimed at limiting those DEI programs.
Yeah, this is where things get pretty interesting from a legal perspective.
Yeah.
So we have the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, that's the higher court. They overturn a nationwide injunction from a lower court. And for those who don't speak legalese, a nationwide injunction is basically a court order that stops a policy from being enforced across the whole country.
Huge.
Huge. This means the administration can now enforce these executive orders even while the legal challenges against them continue. Basically, these orders go after what they call equity-related grants and contracts from federal agencies, and they require federal contractors to certify that they're not promoting DEI programs that violate anti-discrimination laws.
So those equity-related initiatives, that's things like programs designed to increase representation from underrepresented groups, right?
Right.
And the appeals court is basically saying that the lower court may have been wrong in thinking that the groups challenging these orders were likely to win their case.
Exactly. And while all three judges on the panel agreed to lift that injunction, they each wrote separate opinions, which shows you how complex this is. There are still a lot of legal issues to work through, especially when it comes to the First Amendment and how these orders will actually be implemented.
So this is a pretty big win for the Trump administration. It could lead to major changes in how federal agencies and contractors approach DEI. But, as you said, this isn't over yet. The legal battles continue.
Definitely not over yet. And this whole situation really brings to light the fundamental differences in opinion about DEI. You have one side, often Republicans, who stress the importance of merit-based systems and worry about DEI leading to unfair advantages.
Right, giving preference.
Right. And then you have the other side, the proponents of DEI, who argue that these programs are absolutely essential for addressing inequalities and creating truly inclusive environments. So you have that fundamental clash of viewpoints playing out here.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on to an event that definitely got people talking. President Trump's speech at the Justice Department.
Yeah, that was something else. Choosing the Justice Department as the venue? Well, that was a very deliberate move. He used this platform to air a lot of grievances about those past criminal investigations he faced.
Yeah, it was considered pretty unusual, right? I mean, given the Justice Department's traditional independence from politics, having a former president, especially one who may run again, give a speech like that, there's definitely not the norm.
Right, it's a big break from tradition. And you have to understand, he was really going after his opponents, presenting himself as the victim of these politically motivated attacks. He even said he was going to expose his enemies and get rid of what he called rogue actors and corrupt forces.
Strong words.
Strong words. He specifically called out CNN and MSNBC, accusing them of basically being arms of the opposition and engaging in what he called illegal activities through their reporting on him.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he also repeated those claims about the 2020 election being rigged, saying that those responsible should even be put in jail. Of course, these claims have never been substantiated.
Right.
And you have to remember, this was at the Justice Department, the very institution that investigated him previously. So it really shows how focused he remains on these past legal battles, and maybe even a desire to exert influence over federal law enforcement.
It felt more like a campaign rally than an official address at a government building.
Oh, absolutely. Reports say there were even supporters in the audience, and they played upbeat music beforehand.
Really?
Yeah, very rally-like. And he even referred to himself as the country's chief law enforcement officer. Now, that's a title usually reserved for the Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department.
Right.
So while he said he was going to talk about administration policies on things like crime, drugs, and immigration, it ended up being mostly a platform for his personal grievances and political rhetoric.
Okay, I see. Before we jump into international news, let's touch on some other national stories just to give us a fuller picture of what's going on.
Sure, that's a good idea.
Okay, so SpaceX had a successful launch of another crew to the ISS, the International Space Station, to replace those NASA astronauts whose return was delayed.
Right.
Then we have a federal judge considering blocking GE. They don't specify which agency that is from getting access to Social Security data.
Interesting.
Yeah, and there have been warnings about public safety risks because of staff cuts at those agencies that are responsible for making sure dams are safe.
Makes you think.
Yeah. Oh, and there's a permanent restriction now on helicopter traffic near that airport in the D.C. area because of that tragic accident that happened a while back.
Right, I remember that.
It's really sad. Oh, and J.D. Vance, the author and commentator, he got a lot of backlash online for a comment he made on social media that some people thought was a threat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was pretty controversial. And an Indian student at Columbia University, Rajani Srinivasan, well, she reportedly self-deported, meaning she left the country on her own after her visa was revoked.
What happened?
Seems it was because of her involvement in some pro-Palestinian protests.
I see.
Yeah. Elon Musk also got a ton of criticism for reposting this message that compared government workers to, get this, regimes that commit genocide.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, not a good look. Oh, and there was a recall of over 75,000 bottles of this popular coffee creamer.
Why?
Because of spoilage and people getting sick.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah, so just a quick overview of some of the other things happening around the country.
Wow, a lot going on.
Yeah.
All right, let's shift our focus now to the international scene where some really important things are developing.
Absolutely. Starting with the conflict between Israel and Gaza, things took a very tragic turn recently.
Sadly, an Israeli airstrike in Gaza killed at least 9 people, including aid workers and journalists.
So these individuals were with a UK-based organization called the Al Care Foundation, and they were reportedly in Beit Lahia, that's in northern Gaza, setting up tents for people displaced by the conflict and documenting their humanitarian work.
It's just awful. The Israeli military claims they were targeting 2 terrorists operating a drone, and that a second strike hit people who were collecting equipment from that drone.
But the Al Care Foundation completely denies those accusations. They say their team had nothing to do with any terrorist activity.
Yeah, and Hamas, they condemned the airstrike, calling it a horrific massacre, and even suggesting it was done on purpose to derail the ceasefire talks.
Makes you wonder.
It does. This whole thing has sparked international outrage. The Australian Prime Minister, for instance, is demanding a full investigation since one of those killed was an Australian citizen. And the U.S. National Security Council is also trying to get answers.
It's just a terrible situation all around.
It is. This highlights the immense danger that aid workers and journalists face in conflict zones, and it raises serious questions about rules of engagement and how civilians are protected.
So true.
And with these conflicting accounts of what happened, it just makes the already fragile ceasefire even more precarious.
Absolutely. Okay, let's turn to another major global concern, the situation in Ukraine. Things are still extremely tense there, especially in the Kursk region, that border area between Russia and Ukraine.
Right, and Russia's claiming that its forces have retaken even more villages within their own Kursk border region.
Really?
Yeah, they say it's part of an offensive against Ukrainian troops who've held some territory in that area since August of 2023.
2023, that's a while.
Yeah. President Putin even went so far as to say Russian forces have isolated or blocked Ukrainian troops in the Kursk Oblast and called on them to surrender. He's promising them their lives and dignified treatment if they do.
Wow. Which, by the way, comes after President Trump publicly asked Putin to spare the lives of those Ukrainian soldiers.
Right, but Ukraine's general staff is pushing back on this whole narrative. They're denying any encirclement, saying their units have regrouped and moved to better defensive positions and that they've successfully repelled the Russian offensive.
Two very different stories.
Exactly. Classic case of conflicting reports in an active war zone.
Amid all of this, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced that military leaders from various countries are going to meet to discuss the possibility of a peacekeeping force for Ukraine once a ceasefire is eventually reached.
Interesting. But remember, Russia has been very vocal about its opposition to Western forces being in Ukraine.
True. And Ukrainian President Zelenskyy has accused Russia of trying to sabotage peace efforts. He's calling for more international pressure to be put on Russia to stop the fighting.
Yeah. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has also urged Russia to support a ceasefire.
So, still a very complex and concerning situation with a lot at stake for the whole world.
Absolutely.
Okay, while we're on international news, there were some other things worth mentioning to round out our global picture.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So, Pope Francis has made it clear that he plans to continue as Pope and has launched a new reform process within the Catholic Church. And Canada have a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who just appointed his cabinet. Notably, 2 of the key positions have gone to women of Indian origin.
That's great.
Yeah, it is. Then there's Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, that messaging app. He's been given temporary permission to leave France, even though he's facing legal charges there.
That's interesting.
It is. Also, a UN report highlighted how Iran is increasingly using technology, drones, facial recognition, apps to keep tabs on women and arrest those who aren't following the hijab laws.
Wow.
Yeah, a little unsettling. And there's a Peruvian farmer who's filed this landmark lawsuit against RWE, a big German energy company, claiming that their emissions are melting glaciers in the Andes, which is directly impacting his livelihood.
Oh, I see. So he's holding them accountable for climate change.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. Then we have scientists saying they've detected this strange heartbeat coming from space, which has really captured people's imagination.
A heartbeat from space.
Yeah. Very mysterious. Over in Australia, authorities are threatening to deport this American social media influencer, Sam Jones, because of a video she posted online.
Oh, wow. Serious stuff.
Yeah. And President Trump is taking credit for the killing of a top ISIS leader in Iraq.
That's a big deal.
It is. But on a sadder note, there are reports that Daniel Kahneman, the famous psychologist, ended his life by assisted suicide in Switzerland.
Oh, that's terrible.
It is. The Pakistan army had a strong reaction to some advice from India after a train hijacking, and the Trump administration is thinking about restricting travel from citizens of 41 countries, including Pakistan and Myanmar.
Wow, 41 countries. That's a lot.
It is. NASA and SpaceX successfully launched Crew 10 to the ISS, partly to bring back those astronauts who were stuck there.
Right, those whose return was delayed.
Exactly. And Republican lawmakers here in the U.S. have introduced a bill to stop Chinese citizens from getting visas to study or participate in exchange programs here.
Oh, wow, that's a pretty big move.
It is. And just to round things out, there were a bunch of news headlines coming out of the Adventist Church from around the world.
It sounds like it was a packed day for global news.
It really was.
So much happening all over the place.
Yeah, definitely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the news of March 15th, 2025, we hope you have a better grasp of what happened today and why it matters.
And I think what's really interesting is how many of these seemingly separate events are actually connected in some way. Like, policy changes in one country can ripple out and affect international relations. Conflicts impact humanitarian work and global stability.
Right. It really shows how interconnected our world is.
Absolutely.
So here's something for you to think about. Considering all these different perspectives and developments we've talked about, from those debates around DEI to the ongoing conflicts and the growing influence of technology, what core principles do you believe should guide our understanding of progress on a global scale? And what role do each of us play in shaping that progress?
That's a great question. It's worth really taking some time to reflect on.
Yeah, definitely. We encourage you to really think critically about what we've discussed and maybe even explore some of these topics further on your own.
I agree. There's always more to learn.
Always. And I have a feeling the things we talked about today, those big policy changes, the complex conflicts, the impact of technology, those are going to continue to dominate the headlines in the days and weeks to come.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Bye.